The stagecoach rattled through the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory, its wooden wheels groaning under the weight of passengers and luggage as it approached the small settlement of Clearwater Springs. Inside, Eleanor Thompson clutched her well-worn leather satchel, her knuckles white with anxiety. The 32-year-old Boston native had traveled over 1,000 miles to meet a man she knew only through a series of increasingly desperate letters. James Miller, a cattle rancher who had advertised for a bride in an eastern newspaper. As the coach hit another rut in the road, Eleanor's stomach lurched, though whether from the rough terrain or her mounting apprehension, she couldn't say. The weight of her decision hung heavy on her shoulders. This wasn't how she had imagined her life would unfold. But after the devastating Boston fire had claimed both her seamstress shop and her modest savings, the advertisement promising a comfortable life for a woman of good character, willing to help establish a home in Wyoming Territory, had seemed like divine intervention, or perhaps her last resort. "First time out west, ma'am?" The gruff voice of the man sitting across from her broke through her thoughts. He was weathered and leathery, with a thick mustache and eyes that had clearly seen their share of frontier hardship. "Yes," Eleanor replied, smoothing the wrinkles from her travel-worn dress. "I'm to be married in Clearwater Springs." The words felt foreign on her tongue, a script she was reciting, rather than her own truth. She had agreed to marry a stranger, in a place she'd never been, all because Boston no longer held anything for her but ashes and debt. The old-timer nodded knowingly, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of amusement and sympathy. "Mail-order bride, eh? Well, there are worse fates out here. Who's the lucky fella?" He shifted in his seat, adjusting the worn Stetson that sat atop his silver-streaked hair. "A rancher named James Miller," Eleanor said, her voice barely audible above the clatter of the coach. She had memorized his letters, searching for clues about the man who would soon be her husband. James had described himself as a hard-working, God-fearing man of 45, with a successful cattle operation and a newly built two-story house. A rarity in these parts, he'd boasted. What he'd failed to mention, and what Eleanor had been forced to piece together from his infrequent writings, was why a successful rancher would need to send away for a wife. The old man's expression changed, almost imperceptibly. But Eleanor caught it. A flicker of something that looked unsettlingly like pity. "Miller's place, eh? Big spread north of town? Man's done well for himself, no doubt about that." His tone was carefully neutral, but there was an undercurrent that made Eleanor's heart sink even further. Before she could ask what he meant, the stagecoach began to slow, and the driver's voice called out that they were approaching Clearwater Springs. "I'd like to kindly ask you to subscribe to our channel. We'd love to know which city you're watching from today." Eleanor peered anxiously through the small window as the coach rolled into town. Clearwater Springs was a far cry from Boston's bustling streets and brick buildings. A single dirt road cut through the center, lined with wooden structures, a general store, a saloon, a small church, and various other establishments, all looking as though they'd sprouted haphazardly from the hard-packed earth. Men in dusty clothes and worn boots moved purposefully along the boardwalks, while a few women in simple dresses hurried about their business. This was to be her home now, this raw, unrefined place where civilization seemed to be holding on by its fingernails. As the coach pulled to a stop, in front of what appeared to be the town's only hotel, Eleanor's throat tightened. Standing on the boardwalk, scanning the coach with evident anticipation, was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark coat and hat. Even from a distance, she could see the hard lines of his face, weathered by sun and wind. James Miller had come to claim his bride. When Eleanor stepped down from the stagecoach, the full weight of her decision crashed upon her like a physical blow. The dry, hot air filled her lungs, so different from the damp chill of Boston, making her feel as though she couldn't properly breathe. James Miller approached with long, confident strides, his expression difficult to read beneath the shadow of his hat brim. He was a handsome man in a rugged way, with a strong jaw and piercing blue eyes. But there was something in those eyes that gave Eleanor pause, a coldness perhaps, or a calculation that sent a shiver through her despite the afternoon heat. He was older than she had expected, closer to 50 than the 45 he had claimed, with streaks of gray at his temples and deep creases around his eyes and mouth. His hands, when he reached for her carpetbag, were large and calloused, working hands that spoke of the hard life he'd led. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice deep and surprisingly cultured, "welcome to Clearwater Springs. I trust your journey was comfortable." He didn't smile as he spoke, merely assessed her with those penetrating eyes, as though checking the condition of newly delivered livestock. Eleanor straightened her spine, determined not to show weakness. "As comfortable as could be expected, Mr. Miller. Thank you for meeting me." She spoke with a formality born of nervousness, acutely aware of the curious glances from townsfolk passing by. The mail-order bride had arrived. She could practically hear the whispers starting already. Miller nodded, seemingly satisfied with what he saw. "You'll want to rest after your journey. I've arranged for you to stay at the hotel tonight. We'll be married by Pastor Green tomorrow morning, and then I'll take you out to the ranch." His tone made it clear this was not a suggestion, but a statement of fact, a plan already set in motion that allowed for no deviation. Eleanor's heart sank further. She had hoped for at least a few days to acclimatize, to get to know the man she was to marry before committing herself irrevocably. But James Miller was not a man accustomed to waiting, it seemed. "So soon?" Eleanor couldn't keep the dismay from her voice. "Mr. Miller, I thought perhaps we might have some time to become better acquainted before—" "There's no sense in delay." Miller cut her off, his tone brooking no argument. "I've waited 3 months since your acceptance letter. The spring cattle drive starts next week, and I need everything settled before then." His gaze softened marginally, perhaps recognizing her distress. "You'll have plenty of time to get acquainted with me and the ranch afterward. The house is ready for a woman's touch, as I mentioned in my letters." Eleanor swallowed her objections, reminding herself of her precarious situation. She had spent nearly the last of her money on the journey west. There was no turning back now, no safe haven waiting in Boston if she changed her mind. "Of course," she said quietly, forcing a smile that felt brittle on her lips. "Tomorrow morning will be fine." As Miller led her toward the hotel, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap of her own making. The weight of her decision pressed down on her with each step across the dusty street. What kind of man sent away for a bride like ordering goods from a catalog? And what desperate circumstances had brought him to such a pass? The questions tumbled through her mind as they reached the hotel's small porch. Just as Miller reached for the door, a commotion down the street caught their attention. A group of cowboys had emerged from the saloon, laughing raucously. One of them, a tall figure with broad shoulders and an easy stance, looked in their direction and froze momentarily. Even from a distance, Eleanor could feel the intensity of his gaze. Miller's hand tightened on her elbow, his body tensing beside her. "Town trash," he muttered under his breath. "Come inside, Miss Thompson. Clearwater has its share of undesirables, like any frontier town." But as he ushered her through the door, Eleanor glanced back, meeting the mysterious cowboy's stare. Something passed between them in that brief exchange. A recognition, perhaps, though she couldn't have said of what. All she knew was that for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she felt a flicker of something other than dread. And that realization was perhaps the most frightening thing of all. The hotel room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the main street of Clearwater Springs. After James Miller had deposited her bag and left with a curt reminder of their morning appointment at the church, Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back to fall. What had she done? Had desperation truly driven her to bind herself to a man who regarded her with all the warmth one might show a newly purchased tool? As the shadows lengthened across the floor, Eleanor moved to the window, watching as the town transformed in the fading light. Lanterns were lit in windows and along the boardwalk, and the sounds of piano music drifted from the saloon down the street. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since a meager breakfast on the stagecoach. But the thought of venturing out alone in this strange place intimidated her. Just as she was considering whether to brave the hotel's small dining room, a soft knock came at her door. "Who is it?" Eleanor called, hastily wiping away the last traces of tears from her cheeks. "Sarah Winters, ma'am. I own the millinery across the street. Thought you might appreciate some company and perhaps some dinner." The voice was warm and friendly, with a slight southern lilt that immediately put Eleanor at ease. When Eleanor opened the door, she found herself facing a plump, pleasant-faced woman of perhaps 40, dressed in a practical brown dress with her hair neatly pinned up. Sarah Winters smiled warmly, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "The whole town knows James Miller's bride has arrived. I thought you might be feeling a bit overwhelmed, especially with the wedding tomorrow." Over a simple but hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread in the hotel's small dining room, Sarah Winters proved to be a treasure trove of information about Clearwater Springs and its inhabitants. She spoke of the town's founding 10 years earlier, the recent expansion thanks to the railroad 30 miles south, and the various businesses and families that made up the community. Eleanor listened attentively, grateful for this crash course in her new home. But she couldn't help noticing how the conversation carefully skirted around one particular subject, James Miller. Finally, as they lingered over coffee, Eleanor gathered her courage. "Mrs. Winters, may I ask you something about my fiancé? You seem to know everyone in town, and She hesitated, unsure how to articulate her concerns without sounding ungrateful or disloyal to a man she was set to marry in less than 12 hours. Sarah's expression grew serious, her earlier cheerfulness fading. "James Miller is one of the most successful ranchers in the territory," she began carefully. "His cattle operation employs a dozen men, and he's got one of the finest houses for 50 miles. He's a founding member of our church and contributes generously to town improvements." She paused, seeming to choose her next words with extreme care. "He's also had 2 wives before you." Eleanor's cup froze, halfway to her lips. 2? He mentioned being widowed once, but not... His first wife, Margaret, died in childbirth about 8 years ago, Sarah continued quietly. Both she and the baby were lost. His second wife, Clara, was also from back east. She left after less than a year of marriage, returned to her family in Pennsylvania, from what I understand. The implications of this revelation hung heavy in the air between them. Eleanor set down her cup with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. "Left? Do you know why?" Sarah glanced around the nearly empty dining room and leaned closer. James Miller is not an easy man, Miss Thompson. He expects perfection in his home, just as he does on his ranch. Clara was a city girl who couldn't adapt to the isolation and his exacting standards. There were rumors of... She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. But they were only rumors, and it's not my place to repeat them. I just thought you should know what you're walking into, especially with the wedding planned so hastily. Eleanor felt as though the floor was tilting beneath her. Mrs. Winters, I appreciate your candor, but I'm not sure what options I have at this point. I've spent nearly everything getting here, and I have nothing to return to in Boston. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Eleanor's hand. There are always options, dear. Clearwater Springs needs talented women. If you can sew... I owned a small dressmaking shop before the fire, Eleanor admitted, a flicker of hope kindling inside her. Then you already have a skill that's in high demand here, Sarah said firmly. I've been looking for someone to help with alterations at my shop. The accommodations would be modest, just a room above the store. But it would give you time to establish yourself, make your own way. You needn't marry James Miller tomorrow if your heart warns against it. For the first time since arriving in Clearwater Springs, Eleanor felt a glimmer of possibility, a crack in the seemingly solid wall of her fate. Before she could respond, however, the dining room door opened, and the cowboy she had noticed earlier walked in. Up close, he was even more striking. Tall and lean, with warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners, and a day's worth of stubble darkening his jaw. He removed his hat upon entering, revealing thick, sandy hair in need of a trim. When he saw Eleanor and Sarah, he hesitated briefly before approaching their table with an easy, confident gait. Mrs. Winters, he greeted with a respectful nod, his voice a pleasant baritone with the faintest hint of a southern drawl. Ma'am, he added, addressing Eleanor with a tip of his hat. There was something in his gaze as it met hers, a recognition, an intensity that made her breath catch. Matthew Caldwell, Sarah said, her tone noticeably cooler than it had been moments before. Miss Thompson is tired from her journey. We were just finishing up. Matthew Caldwell's eyes never left Eleanor's face. Miss Thompson, James Miller's bride-to-be, I presume? There was an undercurrent to his words that Eleanor couldn't quite decipher, but which sent a flush of warmth to her cheeks nonetheless. Yes, Eleanor replied, finding her voice. And you are? Just a cowhand passing through, he said with a small smile that suggested there was far more to the story. But it seems we'll be neighbors of sorts. I work the Barnes Ranch, which borders Miller's property to the west. He paused, something unreadable flickering across his features. I wish you happiness in your upcoming marriage, Miss Thompson. James Miller is a fortunate man. The way he emphasized those last words sent a chill through Eleanor, though whether of warning or something else entirely, she couldn't say. Before she could respond, Sarah Winters stood abruptly. It's getting late, and Miss Thompson has a big day tomorrow. We should be going. Matthew Caldwell stepped back, his expression neutral once more. Of course. Good evening, ladies. As Eleanor followed Sarah from the dining room, she felt the cowboy's gaze on her back like a physical touch. There was history there. Bad blood between Matthew Caldwell and James Miller. That much was obvious even to a newcomer. And something told Eleanor that this unspoken conflict would soon become relevant to her own precarious situation in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Sleep eluded Eleanor that night, her mind churning with the revelations of the evening and the momentous step she was about to take. By dawn, dark circles shadowed her eyes as she stood before the small mirror in her room, pinning up her chestnut hair and donning the best dress she had brought, a dove-gray silk that had seen better days, but was still presentable enough for a wedding. Not the white gown she had once dreamed of, but then nothing about this marriage matched her girlhood fantasies. Sarah Winters had promised to meet her at the church, a small comfort in what otherwise felt like a march to the gallows. As Eleanor fastened the cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother at her throat, a knock sounded at her door. Expecting the hotel proprietor, she was startled to find Matthew Caldwell standing in the hallway, his expression grave. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, instinctively stepping back. "This is highly improper. I'm to be married in less than an hour, which is precisely why I'm here, Miss Thompson." His voice was low and urgent. "There are things you should know about James Miller before you bind yourself to him for life." Elaine's heart pounded in her chest. "Mrs. Winters already told me he's been married twice before, that his second wife left him and returned east." A muscle twitched in Matthew's jaw. "Did she tell you why Clara Miller fled in the middle of the night, terrified for her life? Did she tell you about the bruises she tried to hide whenever she came to town? Or how Miller keeps his ranch isolated and his wife, virtual prisoner, forbidden from forming friendships or even visiting town without him?" His eyes burned with an intensity that both frightened and compelled Eleanor. "Miller is a cruel man who breaks what he can't control. I've seen it firsthand, not just with his wives, but with his ranch hands and even his livestock. He's respected in town because of his money and power. But those who've worked for him know the truth." Eleanor's legs felt suddenly weak, and she sank onto the edge of the bed. "How do you know all this? Why should I believe you instead of the respected citizens of this town?" But even as she asked, she knew the answer, had sensed it in Miller's cold eyes and controlling manner from their first meeting. Matthew's expression softened slightly. "Because I worked at the Miller Ranch for 2 years. I was there when Clara arrived, full of Eastern optimism, just like you. I watched that light die in her eyes, little by little, until the night she begged me to help her escape." He paused, pain flickering across his features. "Miller blamed me for corrupting his wife, had me beaten and fired, would have killed me if he could have gotten away with it. I found work with Samuel Barnes, a decent man who's been in a land dispute with Miller for years. So this could just be about your grudge against him," Eleanor whispered, though she didn't really believe it. There was too much raw honesty in Matthew's eyes. "I have no reason to lie to you, Miss Thompson. I'm risking Miller's wrath just by speaking to you." He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You have options. Mrs. Winters would help you. Samuel Barnes would give you a job as a housekeeper at the ranch until you find your feet. You don't have to marry a man you fear." Eleanor stood shakily, moving to the window. The street below was coming to life with morning activity, and she could see James Miller emerging from the general store, checking his pocket watch, a man accustomed to punctuality and obedience. "What would happen if I simply didn't appear at the church?" she asked softly. "Miller isn't a man who accepts rejection or defiance," Matthew said grimly. "He'd see it as a personal insult, especially in front of the whole town. He'd likely come looking for you, demand repayment for your stagecoach ticket at the very least." "Then, what am I to do?" Eleanor turned back to him, desperation edging into her voice. "I have $23 to my name. I can't simply disappear." Matthew's expression turned resolute. "You can, if someone helps you. I have a horse saddled behind the hotel. Samuel Barnes is driving a wagon to Riverford today. It's the next settlement, about 40 miles east. You could be on that wagon and gone before Miller even realizes you're not coming to the church. Eleanor stared at him, scarcely able to believe what he was suggesting. You would do that for a woman you just met? Why? Something flickered in Matthew's eyes. Determination, certainly, but also something deeper, more personal, because no one helped Clara until it was almost too late. Because Miller has hurt enough people in his quest to own this valley. And because he hesitated, then finished softly. Because when you stepped down from that stagecoach yesterday, I saw something in your eyes that I recognized. A spirit too strong to be broken by the likes of James Miller. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Eleanor looked around the small hotel room, at her meager belongings still mostly packed in her valise. What did she really have to lose? A loveless marriage to a man who had already driven one wife away, and possibly worse? The gamble of starting over in Clearwater Springs with nothing but her sewing skills and the kindness of virtual strangers? Neither option offered security, but only one offered the possibility of freedom. With suddenly steady hands, Eleanor reached for her valise. How much time do we have? Relief washed over Matthew's features. 15 minutes at most. Miller will head to the church soon, expecting to find you there with Mrs. Winters. Eleanor nodded, hastily gathering the last of her possessions. Mr. Caldwell, Matthew, if I do this, if I go to Riverford, what then? I'll still be without prospects, without connections. Samuel Barnes has a sister there who runs a boarding house. She's always looking for help, and she's a fair employer. It would be a start. He glanced nervously toward the window. We need to hurry, Miss Thompson. Eleanor, she corrected him, making her decision. If you're helping me flee my own wedding, I think we're beyond formalities. She fastened her cloak with trembling fingers, her mind racing ahead to the consequences of what she was about to do. Miller will blame you for this. He'll come after you. A grim smile touched Matthew's lips. Let him try. The feud between Miller and Barnes has been simmering for years. This will just bring it to a head, sooner rather than later. He reached for her valise. Are you ready? Eleanor took one last look around the room, at the narrow bed where she had spent a sleepless night, tormented by doubts. Doubts that now seemed like warning signs she should have heeded sooner. Yes, she said firmly. I'm ready. Matthew led her quickly down the back stairs of the hotel, checking each corner before proceeding. The early morning bustle of Clearwater Springs provided some cover as they slipped through the narrow alley behind the buildings. A bay gelding waited, tethered to a hitching post, saddlebags already packed. Matthew secured Eleanor's valise and helped her mount, then swung up behind her. Hold tight, he murmured close to her ear as he urged the horse forward at a brisk trot. They skirted the edge of town, avoiding the main street where they might be spotted. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest, partly from fear of discovery, but also from the unexpected intimacy of sitting pressed against Matthew's solid chest, his arms around her as he handled the reins. As they crested a small rise and Clearwater Springs fell away behind them, Eleanor finally allowed herself to exhale. I can't believe I'm doing this, she whispered, half to herself. Running away on my wedding day with a man I barely know, from a man I barely know. Matthew's chuckle vibrated against her back. When you put it that way, it does sound rather dramatic, like something out of a dime novel. His tone grew more serious. We're headed for the crossing at Willow Creek. Barnes will be waiting with the wagon about 3 miles from town. Why are you really doing this, Matthew? Eleanor asked, needing to understand the man who was risking so much on her behalf. Is it truly just to thwart James Miller? There was a long pause, filled only with the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth. Clara Miller reminded me of my sister, he finally said, his voice low. Same delicate build, same gentle nature. By the time I realized what was happening at the ranch, she was already trapped, too afraid to leave, too proud to admit the mistake she'd made. When she finally got desperate enough to run, her spirit was nearly broken. Another pause. I promised myself I'd never stand by and watch that happen to another woman if I could prevent it. Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. What happened to her? To Clara? Last I heard, she'd made it back to her family in Pennsylvania, started teaching school there. There was a note of satisfaction in his voice. Miller sent men looking for her, but her brothers made it clear what would happen if he didn't leave her be. They rode in silence for a time, the landscape opening up around them. Rolling hills covered in spring grass, dotted with wildflowers and the occasional stand of cottonwoods. It was beautiful in its wild, untamed way, so different from the brick-lined streets and crowded buildings of Boston. Despite the danger of her situation, Eleanor felt a curious lightness spreading through her, the sense of possibility she hadn't experienced since before the fire that had destroyed her old life. I never thought I'd end up in a place like this, she admitted. When I was a girl, I dreamed of Paris, of designing beautiful gowns for society ladies. Instead, I had a small shop on a back street in Boston, mending more often than creating. She laughed softly. And now here I am, fleeing across the Wyoming territory on horseback. Life rarely follows the paths we imagine for it, Matthew replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. I was supposed to take over my father's hardware store in Missouri. Instead, I headed west after the war, worked as a cowhand, a blacksmith's assistant, even tried my hand at prospecting for a season. He guided the horse around a particularly rocky patch. Found I had a way with horses, ended up breaking and training them for ranchers. That's how I came to work for Miller initially. And now, at the Barnes Ranch, Samuel's a good man who believes in fair treatment of both animals and people. He lets me run the horse training program my way. And I help with the cattle when needed. It's a decent life. His arms tightened slightly around her as the horse negotiated a steeper incline. What will you do in Riverford once you're settled? Eleanor considered the question. Return to dressmaking, I suppose. It's what I know. Though frontier fashion is somewhat different from Boston society styles, she smiled wryly. I'll adapt. I've already come this far. You're braver than you give yourself credit for, Matthew observed. Not many women would have the courage to walk away from the security of marriage, even to a man like Miller. Is it courage or just self-preservation? Eleanor wondered aloud. I've been taking care of myself since I was 17. The idea of being under a man's thumb, especially one like James Miller. She shuddered involuntarily. Either way, Matthew said, I admire it. There was a warmth in his voice that sent a flutter through Eleanor's chest, a feeling so unexpected that it momentarily startled her. This was hardly the time for such reactions, she chided herself. She was in the midst of upending her life yet again, fleeing to another unfamiliar town with no guarantees. Developing an infatuation with her rescuer was the height of foolishness. They crested another hill, and Matthew suddenly reined the horse to a stop. Look there, he said, his voice tight with alarm. In the distance, a plume of dust rose from the road. Riders approaching fast from the direction of Clearwater Springs. Miller must have gone to the hotel when you didn't show up at the church. We need to move, now. He urged the horse into a gallop, heading toward a line of trees that marked the creek bed ahead. Eleanor clung to the saddle horn, her heart in her throat, as the horse's pace increased, eating up the ground with long strides. The riders behind them were still too distant to make out clearly, but they were definitely in pursuit, and there were at least 3 of them. "Will we reach Mr. Barnes in time?" Eleanor called over her shoulder, the wind snatching at her words. "We have to," Matthew replied grimly. "Hold tight. We're going to cut through the creek and take the ridge trail. It's rougher terrain, but it might slow them down." The gelding splashed through the shallow creek, water spraying as they emerged on the other side and began to climb the steep bank. Matthew guided the horse with expert precision, weaving through trees and over rocky ground that would have been treacherous to a less experienced rider. Eleanor could only hold on and trust in his abilities and the horse's sure-footedness. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, hoofbeats and men's voices calling to each other. As they reached the top of the ridge, Matthew risked a glance back. "Miller's there," he said tersely, "with Tyler and Jenkins, 2 of his ranch hands. They're armed." Fear clutched at Eleanor's throat. "They wouldn't shoot us, surely, not in cold blood." "Miller's capable of anything when his pride is wounded," Matthew answered, urging the horse along the ridgeline. "But he'll want to take us alive, you to force into marriage, me to make an example of." The grim certainty in his voice left no doubt that he believed what he was saying. "There's the Barnes wagon," he added with palpable relief, pointing to a spot ahead where the ridge trail descended to rejoin the main road. A canvas-covered wagon stood waiting, an older man with a silver beard at the reins. As they thundered down toward the wagon, Samuel Barnes spotted them and immediately registered the urgency of their approach. He reached for the rifle resting beside him, standing to get a better view of the pursuit. "Miller and his boys?" he called as they drew near. 3 riders, armed, Matthew confirmed, bringing the gelding to a skidding halt beside the wagon. He dismounted quickly, then helped Eleanor down. Her legs trembled beneath her, both from the hard ride and from fear. "Miss Thompson needs safe passage to Riverford, to your sister's place." Barnes nodded grimly, helping Eleanor into the wagon without question. "Been expecting this showdown for years," he said, his weathered face set in determined lines. "Get your horse in the trees, Matthew. We'll make a stand here. Better ground than trying to outrun them." Eleanor's breath caught. "A stand? Mr. Barnes, I can't ask you men to risk your lives for me." "Not just for you, ma'am," Barnes interrupted, his tone kind but firm. "This valley ain't big enough for both Miller's way of doing things and ours. Sooner or later, it was bound to come to a head." He handed her a small revolver from beneath the wagon seat. "You know how to use one of these?" Eleanor stared at the weapon, then shook her head. "I've never—" "Simple enough," Barnes said, quickly showing her how to cock and fire it. "Last resort only. Stay in the wagon, keep low." He turned to Matthew, who had returned from concealing his horse. 2 rifles against 3. Not ideal, but we've got position." The older man grinned suddenly, a fierce light in his eyes. "And righteousness on our side, for whatever that's worth." Matthew's expression was equally determined as he checked his own rifle. "Worth quite a lot in my experience." He glanced at Eleanor, his eyes softening momentarily. "Whatever happens in the next few minutes, Miss Thompson, know that you've done nothing wrong. The choice you've made today was yours to make." Before Eleanor could respond, the thunder of approaching hooves grew louder. James Miller and his men had spotted the wagon and were closing in fast. Miller's face was a mask of fury as he reined his horse to a stop about 50 yards away, his men flanking him with rifles at the ready. "That's far enough, Miller," Barnes called out, his rifle trained steadily on the newcomers. "This doesn't concern you, old man," Miller snarled, his cold eyes fixed on Eleanor where she sat in the wagon. "That woman made a commitment to me. I paid good money to bring her west. and she'll honor her obligation." Eleanor felt a surge of indignation cut through her fear. Standing up in the wagon, despite Matthew's warning glance, she called back, "I made no vows to you, Mr. Miller. Our arrangement—" "You've been poisoned against me by this saddle tramp," he spat, jerking his head toward Matthew. "Caldwell's had it in for me since I threw him off my property for making advances toward my last wife. Now he thinks to steal another from me." "Nobody's stealing what wasn't yours to begin with, Miller," Matthew replied evenly, though Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. "Miss Thompson is a free woman, making her own choice, something you've never been able to stomach. People choosing differently than what you dictate." For a moment, the tableau held, Miller and his men facing Barnes and Matthew across the dusty road, the air between them charged with years of accumulated grievances and the immediate crisis of Eleanor's flight. Then Miller made a slight gesture with his hand, and his men raised their rifles more purposefully. "I'm taking her back," he stated flatly. "Anyone who interferes will regret it. I've got the law on my side. She owes me for that ticket, and Caldwell here is nothing but a thief and a troublemaker." "The law?" Barnes gave a short, harsh laugh. "You mean Sheriff Davis, who looks the other way whenever your cattle mysteriously end up on my range? Or Judge Wilson? Whose more did you hold?" "That law, Miller?" The older man shook his head. "Not today. The lady has made her choice. Accept it and ride away." Eleanor could see the calculation in Miller's eyes, weighing the risk of a shootout against his pride and his desire to force her back to Clearwater Springs. Finally, he addressed her directly. "One step closer to me, and you'll never see Boston again," he warned, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "You'll be a prisoner in my house, with no friends, no connections, nothing but the work I set for you, until you learn your place." The naked threat hung in the air, confirming every warning Matthew had given her about the man she'd nearly married. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor stepped down from the wagon and walked forward deliberately, placing herself between the opposing groups. "One step closer, and I'm gone, Mr. Miller," she replied steadily. "That was the deal I made with myself when I saw the coldness in your eyes yesterday. You may control much of this valley, but you don't control me." She took another step toward Matthew and Barnes, away from Miller, making her choice clear to all present. "I suggest you find a woman who welcomes your particular brand of marriage. I am not that woman." For a long, tense moment, Miller seemed frozen in disbelief that anyone, let alone a woman he considered already his property, would defy him so openly. Then his face contorted with rage, and he raised his rifle. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "All of you." Before he could take aim, Matthew stepped forward, placing himself squarely in front of Eleanor. "It's over, Miller," he said firmly. 3 against 2 aren't odds I'd normally like, but Barnes and I are mighty motivated. You really want to risk dying here today, all because a woman you barely know decided she deserves better than you?" Eleanor held her breath, acutely aware that lives hung in the balance, and that she was the catalyst for this dangerous confrontation. The silence stretched, broken only by the nervous shuffling of horses and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Finally, Miller lowered his rifle slightly. "This isn't finished," he said, his voice cold with promise. "Not by a long shot." He glanced at his men. "We're riding back, for now." With a last venomous look at Eleanor, he wheeled his horse around and spurred it back toward Clearwater Springs, his men following close behind. No one moved until the riders had disappeared from sight. Then Eleanor's legs gave way beneath her, the tension of the confrontation draining her remaining strength. Matthew was at her side instantly, supporting her with a gentle hand at her elbow. "You were magnificent," he said softly, admiration clear in his eyes. "I've never seen anyone stand up to Miller like that." "Foolhardy is what it was," Barnes commented, though his weathered face creased in a smile. "Brave but foolhardy. Miller doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget. He'll be looking for payback." "Then we'll be ready," Matthew replied, his gaze still on Eleanor. "Are you all right? You're shaking." Eleanor nodded, attempting a smile that came out more like a grimace. "I've never faced down an armed man before. It's not an experience I care to repeat." She looked up at him, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred, and what might have happened. "You were willing to take a bullet for me, a woman you just met yesterday." Matthew's expression turned serious. "Some things a man just knows are worth fighting for, Miss Thompson. Your freedom to choose your own path is one of them." There was something in his eyes that made Eleanor's heart beat faster. A warmth, a promise, a future not yet written, but suddenly possible. Samuel Barnes cleared his throat pointedly. "Touching as this is, we should get moving. Miller's the type to stew on his humiliation, then come back with more men. I'd like to be well on our way to Riverford before that happens." He gestured to the wagon. "Climb aboard, both of you. Matthew, your horse can follow behind." As Matthew helped Eleanor into the wagon, their hands lingered together a moment longer than strictly necessary. "What will you do now?" she asked quietly. "Miller will make life difficult for you and Mr. Barnes." A slow smile spread across Matthew's face. "Difficult isn't the same as impossible. And some things," he squeezed her hand gently, "some people are worth a little difficulty." He climbed up beside her as Barnes took the reins. "Besides, I've been thinking it's time I saw more of the territory. Riverford might be a good place to start a horse training business of my own." Eleanor felt a bubble of unexpected happiness rise within her as the wagon lurched forward. She had come west seeking security and found instead the promise of freedom, and perhaps something more, something that had nothing to do with mail-order arrangements and everything to do with the choice she had made today. As Clearwater Springs and James Miller faded into the distance behind them, Eleanor Thompson looked ahead to the horizon, to Riverford, and to possibilities she had never dared imagine when she'd stepped off that stagecoach just 24 hours ago. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a very long while, uncertainty felt like an adventure rather than a threat. And the man sitting beside her, his shoulder warm against hers as the wagon bounced along the rutted road, seemed like exactly the right companion for whatever lay ahead. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.